Hi, so this is the first video for our polynomials section. I'm going to make several of these, and if you have my notes in Canvas, you can follow right along. Even if you don't have my notes in Canvas, you should still be able to follow along and learn about what we're going to talk about. So the first thing we'll talk about with polynomials is what they're made up of, and those are things called terms. So a term, well, there we go. A term is an algebraic expression that consists of a number, and we'll give that number a name in a second. But it consists of a number multiplied by variables raised to non-negative exponents, meaning 0 or some integer, non-negative integer exponents. There we go. 0 or some positive integer. So here are some examples of terms. What we want to do is think of a number, let's say 5. And then think of some variables, x, y, z, and then give them some non-negative integer exponents. So maybe we have an exponent of 2 on the x, an exponent of 3 on the y, and just an exponent of 1 on the z. So we can leave it like it is. All right, we could have a term that has a negative number in front of it, and it doesn't even have to be a whole number or an integer. It could just be some real number. And then we could give it a variable with a non-negative integer exponent on it. So these both count as terms. What about just 7? Well, it's certainly a number, so that counts as part of the term. But also we have variables after this with non-negative integer exponents, namely 0. So if you don't see any variables over here, that's okay. It just means that the exponents are 0 there. So this also counts as a term. All right, so now that we know what a term is, we can start naming the parts of the term. Okay, so this number on it is called the coefficient of the term. Okay, so whatever number you see on your term, that's called the term coefficient. It might be positive, it might be negative, it might be a whole number, it might be some decimal number, it might be 1, so it might not show up, but it's called the coefficient. Okay, so every term has a coefficient. Every term also has a degree. And the term degree is the sum of the exponents on the variables. There we go. All right, so for this term in particular, the degree is going to be the sum of the exponents on the variables. So if we look at all the exponents on the variables, we have 2 on the x. That's Walter, the cat. We have 3 on the y, and we have a 1 on the z. Oops. So the degree of this term is 2 plus 3 plus 1, 6. Okay, so let's do some more examples with terms, finding their coefficients and finding their degree. All right, so let's look at -5 x squared y cubed. All right, remember the coefficient is the number we see multiplied on the term. So in this case, the coefficient is -5. Okay, the term degree is going to be the sum of the exponents on the variable. So in this case, that'll be 2 plus 3. And the degree on this term is also, it happens to be 5. Okay, let's look at another one. Let's look at the term 12. Now we already talked about why this counts as a term using our definition. It's got a number and it has variables out here raised to non-negative integer exponents. Those non-negative integers just happen to all be 0. So this does count as a term. The coefficient is going to be the number on the term, which in this case is 12. And the degree is going to be the sum of the exponents on the term. Now we already talked about how the sum of the exponents on the variables. We already talked about how this term doesn't have any variables that we can see. That's because the exponents are all 0. So the degree here is 0. All right, so if we just have a number for a term, first of all, that counts, and it has degree 0. Let's look at one more of these. Whenever we start talking about polynomials in one variable, this is what all our terms will look like. Notice it just has the one variable in it. All right, but we find the coefficient the same way. Look for the number that's on the term. In this case, that's 2. And the degree here is a little bit easier because we only have the one variable to look at. There is no sum of exponents that we have to find. It's just the one variable. And in this case, the only exponent there is on a variable is 4. So that's the degree of 4. All right. So now that we know things about terms, let's start talking about putting terms together. And that's when we get into a polynomial. So a polynomial is just the sum of terms. Okay, now some of those terms are going to look like differences, or some of those sums will look like differences if your coefficient is negative. So you'll see some pluses or minuses here and there, but really you're just looking for terms that are either being added or subtracted. Technically they're all being added, but sometimes it'll look like a subtraction. All right, we have different kinds of polynomials depending on how many terms the polynomial has. So we have a monomial, which has one term, and it's just going to look like a term. So an example of a monomial would be 7x squared y, a number with variables raised to non-negative integer powers. Okay, so that's a monomial. All right, we have a binomial. That's a polynomial with two terms. So now we're just going to pick our favorite terms. Negative 2xy plus 3x. That's a binomial. Two terms, these each count as terms, and we added them together. That makes a binomial. Whenever we start to factor in future lessons, we're going to be interested in a trinomial. Okay, a trinomial is a polynomial with three terms. So we're just going to pick our favorite our favorite terms. Add them together. Notice some of the additions look like subtractions because the coefficient here is actually negative. But there's a trinomial, three terms. All right, so if we want to just classify these, that's the next part of the lesson. As an example, something that looks like 4x minus 1. If we wanted to classify that polynomial, we would just count the number of terms that are in it. So the number of terms separated by a plus or minus. And in this case, that would be 4x is a term, negative 1 is a term. This has two terms. It's a binomial. Okay, that's really how it always goes. So whenever you're classifying polynomials, you're really just looking at how many terms are in them. So as another example, 2xy minus 5x plus 1. Well, we'd look at all the terms we have. Term, term, term. That's three of them. So it's a trinomial. Okay, and in the next video, we'll start to look at polynomials in just one variable and then how we add and subtract them.